The streets of Honolulu shimmered under the neon glow, slick with rain as Leilani sprinted toward the bus stop. Her shift at the cafe had drained her, and the thought of missing the last bus sent a sharp pang of worry through her chest. She reached the curb just in time to see the taillights fading into the distance, leaving her stranded in the relentless downpour. Pulling her hoodie tighter, she exhaled, watching the steam of her breath mix with the misty night air. The weight of exhaustion settled over her, pressing her shoulders down like an invisible force.
Hello, I'm going to tell you this incredible story. Put on your headphones for a better experience and sit comfortably because you're going to be moved. Remember that to receive new stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notification bell. Without further ado, let's get to the rest of the story.
The rain showed no mercy. It pelted against the pavement, drenching her shoes, seeping into her very bones. She glanced at her phone, battery dead. Of course, just her luck. The few people who had lingered at the bus stop had already disappeared into the night, leaving her completely alone. Shivering, she debated walking home, but 12 miles in this weather? Not happening. Just as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in what little warmth she had left, headlights sliced through the darkness. A sleek black truck slowed to a stop beside her, its presence as unexpected as a rainbow after a storm. The window rolled down, and a deep, smooth voice cut through the sound of the rain. "Need a ride?" The man behind the wheel was intriguing. Strong jawline, piercing eyes, a quiet confidence that made her pulse stutter for reasons beyond the cold. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Never get into a stranger's car. But standing in the rain, drenched and shivering, the alternative seemed far worse. She hesitated, clutching her bag, eyes darting toward the road. He must have sensed her caution. "Look, I get it. Stranger danger. But I promise, I'm just trying to help." She studied him for a beat longer. His truck was spotless, the leather seats visible from where she stood. This wasn't some rundown vehicle owned by someone with bad intentions. And there was something in his voice, something steady, unwavering, against her better judgment. Or maybe because exhaustion made her reckless. She pulled the door open and slid inside. The warmth wrapped around her instantly, a stark contrast to the chill that had gripped her moments ago. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As the truck rumbled forward, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. "I'm Leilani," she offered, her voice still laced with hesitation. "Jackson," he replied, glancing at her with a knowing smirk, as if he understood the battle she had just fought in her head. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, the world outside a blur of silver streaks. She watched as streetlights flickered past, her reflection in the window barely recognizable. Wet hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't quite comfort either. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but thick with something unspoken. "So," he finally said, breaking through the hum of the engine, "what's a girl like you doing out here alone at this hour?" She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Long story. And wasn't that the truth? Her life had been a collection of almosts. Almost making a home on time, almost saving enough to move somewhere better, almost believing in something more. But tonight, something felt different. She didn't know it yet, but this ride would be the beginning of a story she never saw coming. A real story, one that people would tell with the same kind of wonder that belonged in emotional stories. And as the rain continued to pour, washing away the remnants of a long, exhausting day, she had no idea she was about to step into something bigger than herself. Because sometimes, missed buses lead to unexpected destinations. And sometimes, strangers aren't just strangers. The hum of the engine was steady, almost hypnotic, as Jackson drove through the rain-slick streets. Leilani sat beside him, still wrapped in the warmth of the truck, her fingers nervously tracing the fabric of her damp hoodie. She was used to short, polite conversations with cafe customers, predictable, surface-level exchanges. But there was something different about Jackson, something about the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen the world and yet wasn't weighed down by it. She didn't know why, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to talk. "So, what do you do?" she asked, glancing at him. His grip on the wheel was relaxed, yet firm, like he had everything under control. "Bit of this, bit of that," he replied with a smirk, eyes flicking to her before returning to the road. Vague, mysterious, but there was no arrogance in his tone, just a quiet confidence that made her curiosity spark. He turned the question back on her, and before she knew it, she was telling him about the cafe, about how she'd always dreamed of owning her own place someday. Jackson listened, really listened. Not the way most people did, half distracted, nodding absent-mindedly. No, he asked questions, pushed for details like her story actually mattered. And for someone like Leilani, who had spent most of her life feeling like just another face in the crowd, that meant something. Just as she was starting to feel comfortable, a sudden thump jolted the truck. Jackson cursed under his breath, steering them to the side of the road. Flat tire, in the middle of a storm. "Well," he sighed, running a hand through his rain-damp hair. "That's just perfect." Leilani let out a short laugh. "You got a spare?" He nodded. "Yeah, but I wasn't planning on changing a tire in a downpour tonight." She smirked, already stepping out of the truck. "Good thing I don't mind getting my hands dirty." Jackson watched, slightly amused, slightly skeptical, as she knelt down and got to work. A few minutes later, with skilled hands and a knowing grin, she finished the job, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "Not bad for a cafe girl, huh?" Jackson let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. "All right, I'll admit it, I wasn't expecting that." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just about a flat tire anymore. It was about the unspoken connection crackling in the air between them, the kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. A real story kind of moment. He handed her his jacket, a simple gesture, but one that carried weight. "Can't have you catching a cold after saving my truck." As they climbed back inside, the storm outside seemed less significant. The tension that had once been filled with caution was now something else entirely. Something electric, something neither of them could quite name. The road stretched ahead, unknown and unpredictable, much like whatever was happening between them. And neither of them dared to say it out loud, but they both felt it. This ride wasn't just a ride anymore. The next morning, the familiar hum of the cafe filled the air as Leilani worked behind the counter, the scent of fresh coffee swirling around her. She tried to shake off the lingering thoughts of a night before. The way Jackson had looked at her, the way his presence had left an imprint she couldn't quite explain. But as she turned to take the next order, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, standing by the entrance, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, watching her with a small, unreadable smile. She forced herself to focus, wiping her hands on her apron as he stepped forward. "Didn't take you for a coffee, guy," she teased, her voice steady despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. Jackson chuckled, leaning against the counter. "I'm full of surprises." He ordered a black coffee. No sugar, no cream, simple yet bold. Just like him. But he didn't leave after getting his cup. Instead, he lingered, asking questions, showing genuine interest in her world. It was effortless, the way their conversation flowed, like they had known each other longer than just one rainy night. But the illusion shattered when a customer nearby did a double take, whispering to their companion. "Caldwell. Jackson Caldwell." Leilani frowned as she caught bits and pieces of their hushed conversation. And then, just like that, reality crashed down. A quick internet search on her break confirmed it. Jackson wasn't just some guy passing through. He was heir to one of the largest oil fortunes in Texas. A millionaire. A man who lived in a world that had nothing to do with hers. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. That night, she avoided his texts. She ignored the small part of her that wanted to hear his voice again. How could she have been so naive? She wasn't the kind of girl who got swept up in fairy tales. She knew better. Wealth like his came with expectations, with a lifestyle she didn't fit into. The idea of being just another passing emotional story in his life, a fleeting moment of interest, made her stomach twist. So she made a decision, one that felt logical, even if it hurt. The next time he came by the cafe, she barely looked at him. She was polite, distant, keeping the conversation short. Jackson noticed, of course. "Did I do something?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. She forced a smile, shaking her head. "Just busy," she lied. But even as she said the words, she knew he didn't believe her. And honestly, she didn't believe herself either. Because the truth was, she wasn't just pushing him away. She was pushing away the possibility of something real. Days passed, and she convinced herself she had done the right thing. But late at night, when the cafe was quiet and the world slowed down, her mind drifted back to him. To the way he listened. To the way he looked at her like she mattered. But fairy tales weren't real, were they? She had spent too long surviving in the real world to believe otherwise. And yet, a part of her, no matter how much she fought it, wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had walked away from something she shouldn't have. Jackson wasn't the kind of man to let things go without an answer. He had seen Leilani pull away, had watched her build walls around herself, and he wasn't about to let her disappear without understanding why. So when he walked into the cafe one evening, just before closing, there was no hesitation in his steps. He waited until the last customer left, then locked eyes with her, his expression unreadable but firm. "All right," he said, leaning against the counter. "Are you going to tell me what's going on? Or do I have to guess?" Leilani's stomach twisted. She had hoped he would let it fade, that their connection would dissolve as quickly as it had formed. But now, standing in front of him, she realized how much she had underestimated his persistence. "Nothing's going on," she muttered, wiping down the counter, even though it was already spotless. Jackson wasn't buying it. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but don't lie to me." His voice was calm, steady, but there was something else beneath it. Something raw, something real. She clenched her jaw, the emotion she had tried so hard to suppress bubbling to the surface. "You're a millionaire, Jackson," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "I'm a girl who barely makes rent every month. We live in completely different worlds." Saying it out loud made her chest tighten, but it also made it feel real. There it was, the truth she had been running from. The reason she had convinced herself to walk away before she could get hurt. Because men like Jackson didn't fall for women like her. And if they did, it never lasted. Jackson studied her for a long moment, then took a step closer, his voice softer this time. "You really think this is about money?" His brows furrowed, like the idea itself was ridiculous. "Leilani, I didn't offer you a ride that night because I was looking for some charity project. I didn't come back to this cafe because I wanted to flaunt my bank account. I came back because of you." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "And if you think money has anything to do with how I feel, then you don't know me at all." Leilani felt her defenses cracking. She had spent so much time convincing herself she wasn't worthy, that someone like him could never see her as more than a passing real story, an emotional story for the books. But as she looked into his eyes, she didn't see pity. She didn't see obligation. She saw something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Genuine care. A connection that had nothing to do with his last name or his fortune. And for the first time in days, she felt the tiniest sliver of hope. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared." The confession felt foreign on her tongue, like a secret she had never allowed herself to admit. Jackson exhaled, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." The honesty between them was almost overwhelming, a force stronger than the doubts she had clung to for so long. And in that moment, she realized something. Maybe running had been the real mistake all along. Leilani had spent so much of her life believing love was something fleeting, something that happened to other people but never quite made its way to her doorstep. Yet here she was, standing on the shore of a secluded Hawaiian beach, the waves whispering against the sand as the sky burned gold with the setting sun. Jackson stood in front of her, his eyes steady, his hands holding something small but impossibly significant. A ring. And just like that, the world seemed to still. She had thought about leaving. The offer for a job on the mainland had been tempting. Something stable, something safe. But when she imagined a life without Jackson, the thought felt hollow, like a song without a melody. She had spent too long running, too long believing she wasn't enough. But he had shown her, time and time again, that love wasn't about status, wasn't about wealth. It was about choosing each other, despite everything. And as she looked at him now, she knew she had already made her choice. Jackson's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of vulnerability beneath it. Leilani, I didn't know what I was looking for the night I met you. But I know now. It was you. It's always been you. He took a breath, the ocean breeze ruffling his hair. I don't care where we live, what we have, or what we don't. All I know is that my life makes more sense with you in it. He dropped to one knee, holding up the ring, and for the first time in her life, Leilani felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, blurring the sight of the man who had turned her world upside down. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. Then, louder this time, as if claiming the truth for herself, yes. Jackson slipped the ring on her finger, and the moment his arms wrapped around her, she knew. This wasn't just a dream, wasn't just another emotional story that would fade with time. This was real. This was theirs. A year later, the cafe they ran together became more than just a business. It became a symbol of everything they had built side by side. Customers walked through the doors not just for coffee, but for the warmth, for the energy that pulsed through the space like a heartbeat. And at the center of it all was Leilani, no longer the girl who doubted her worth, but a woman who had learned to embrace love without fear. Because love, she had realized, wasn't about fitting into someone else's world. It was about creating a world together. Somewhere in Texas, Jackson's name still carried weight, still turned heads in elite circles. But here, in this small cafe by the ocean, he was simply Jackson, the man who had once stopped in the rain for a stranger and never looked back. Their story had started with a missed bus and an unexpected ride, but it had become so much more. It had become the kind of love people whisper about, the kind that lingers long after the final chapter. A real story in every sense of the word. And if there was one thing Leilani knew for sure, it was this: sometimes fate has a funny way of bringing two people together. Not through grand gestures, not through perfect timing, but through the little moments, the unexpected detours. And sometimes, a ride in the rain can change everything. Life has a funny way of bringing people together, doesn't it? A missed bus, a stranger's kindness, and suddenly, two lives are forever changed. But here's the real question: was it fate, or just a series of choices that led them here? Would Jackson and Leilani have found each other no matter what? Or was this one of those rare, once-in-a-lifetime moments that almost didn't happen? It makes you wonder, how many times have we walked past something extraordinary, too caught up in our own worries to notice? How often do we let fear hold us back from something real, just because it doesn't look the way we expected? If Leilani had let her doubts win, if Jackson had kept driving, this real story would have never unfolded. And that's the beauty of life. You never know which small decision will change everything. So now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where one small choice led to something bigger than you imagined? Do you believe in fate, or do you think everything is just coincidence? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts. And of course, if you love stories that make you feel something, that remind you how unpredictable and beautiful life can be, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are so many more touching stories waiting for you. See you in the next one.